They called him Toby, the friendly, reliable man who pumped gas at the Ashland City Station on the corner of Main and Clover Street. He never missed a shift. He'd whistle while wiping windshields, call customers by name, and hand out free peppermints to every child in the back seat. For years, he was the face of small-town kindness, dependable, harmless, ordinary. But on a cold Friday night in 1975, Tobias Kincaid's name would burn into Oregon's history for the worst reason imaginable. That night, a 4-year-old teacher named Linda Harper stopped at his station to fill her tank on her way home from a faculty meeting. She never made it home. Her car was later found idling by the roadside, her purse still on the seat, her keys dangling in the ignition like she'd just stepped away for a moment. But the truth was far worse. For decades, no one suspected Toby. The police interviewed him. He smiled politely, told them he'd gone home early, and they believed him. His alibi held. His reputation protected him. He even attended Linda's memorial service, standing among her grieving family, head bowed, the same man who had watched her last breath fade into the Oregon fog. They didn't know that the same hands that offered her a friendly wave that night were the ones that ended her story. For 48 years, Tobias Kincaid was a ghost haunting the same streets, walking past the same gas station rebuilt over his crime, while Linda's name became another cold file buried in dust. Until one detective opened that box again and found the piece of his past he could never bury. Have you ever trusted someone so completely you never even thought to fear them? The night Linda Harper disappeared, the streets of Ashland were slick with February rain. The fog rolled low off the mountains, pressing against the windshield as she steered her faded blue sedan down Lithia Way, the heater rattling softly, the hum of the radio breaking through the static. She was tired, but content, the kind of tired that came from doing something meaningful. She'd just finished leading a reading workshop for local children, one of the dozens of projects she volunteered for after school hours. Linda was the type of person everyone trusted. Her students loved her for the way she made even the quiet ones feel heard. She had plans, real, tangible ones, to move to Portland, teach full-time, and start her master's in education. Her mother said she'd been saving every dollar, clipping coupons, skipping nights out. A dreamer, she'd call her, but one who worked for what she dreamed. That's who she was the last time anyone saw her practical shoes, a soft red coat, a lesson planner sitting on the passenger seat, and the steady hope that life, though small, was good. When she stopped at the gas station that night, she wasn't scared. Not for a second. The man working there, Toby, as everyone called him, was the sort of person you waved to automatically, a constant face in a changing world. She paid for her gas, smiled politely, and got back into her car. The security light flickered above her as the engine turned over. She drove off into the mist, headlights cutting through gray. And then nothing. That's the detail that kept the town awake for months. There were no screams, no sounds of a struggle, no sign of where she went. One moment, she was there. The next, the rain just kept falling, washing every trace of her away. What if your last stop in life was at the place you trusted most? By sunrise, the fog had thinned, but it didn't lift the weight hanging over Ashland. A jogger passing through Lithia Park spotted a car idling near the trailhead. The driver's door was open, the engine still humming, exhaust curling into the damp air. Inside sat Linda's purse, her wallet untouched, her house keys dangling from the ignition. The passenger seat held her lesson planner, pages soaked from the rain, the ink bleeding into unreadable shapes. To anyone else, it looked like a car abandoned in a hurry, but to those who knew Linda, it was wrong, every part of it. She was cautious, careful, a woman who double-checked every door before leaving. Her mother arrived at the scene within the hour, her voice breaking as she said the same thing over and over. She wouldn't leave her things. She wouldn't leave her car. The search began that afternoon, police combing the park, volunteers dragging flashlights through the trees, dogs tracing dead trails through wet leaves. The town came together in fear, in confusion, in denial. People told themselves she'd run away, that maybe she'd decided to start fresh somewhere new. But deep down, Everyone felt it. Something was wrong in Ashland. Something that couldn't be explained by fog or fear. And yet, the man who'd last seen her, Tobias Kincaid, stood quietly in the background of it all, helping, handing out coffee to volunteers, offering prayers, watching as everyone searched for a woman he knew they'd never find alive. The river swelled from the rain that week, rushing faster, colder, hungrier. The search went on for days, but when it finally stopped, Linda Harper's name faded into the quiet of the mountains. Ashland forgot. Tobias didn't. She thought danger came from strangers. She was wrong. Sometimes it wears a familiar smile. Subscribe now, because evil remembers, even when we forget. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The Ashland Police Department wasn't built for tragedy. In 1975, it was a small unit of 12 officers working out of a building that smelled of coffee and damp paper. There was no modern forensics, no databases, no DNA. Just people trying to connect dots with instinct and pencils. When Linda Harper vanished, they didn't know they were facing a case that would outlive most of them. Detective Hank Dwyer was the senior lead, hard-edged, quick to temper, and buried under too many open cases. He'd been a cop long enough to know how stories like this usually ended. His partner, Edna Cole, was one of the few women detectives in Southern Oregon at the time. She was meticulous, sharp, and already fighting the prejudice of working in a room that didn't want her there. Together, they were assigned to find Linda. They started with the car, the purse, the gas receipt, time-stamped at 9:41 p.m., and the last known witness, Toby Kincaid, the local gas station attendant who swore he'd seen her leave alive. She smiled, he told them, said good night, nothing unusual. His statement was steady, practiced, and harmless. But something about him lingered with Dwyer. Maybe it was the way he talked about her, too personal, too detailed. He remembered her coat color, her perfume, the book on her passenger seat. Small things. Things people forget unless they've looked too closely. Still, Dwyer couldn't make a case out of a feeling. Witness reports started pouring in that same night. A dark sedan seen parked near the park. A man standing by the roadside. Another report said they saw Linda walking alone. Another claimed she was picked up by a stranger. None of them matched. The map of sightings stretched across town like a story told by too many mouths. The media jumped on it, calling it the fog case. Newspapers ran headlines about mysterious strangers and women vanishing in Oregon's mountains, but the facts were slipping away faster than the headlines printed them. Behind the noise, Linda's mother, Margaret Harper, sat in her living room writing names down by hand. She called every station, every neighbor, every lead. "Find her," she said through tears. "Don't let her become one of those names." For Dwyer and Cole, that promise became the start of a slow unraveling, a case that would break under the weight of its own good intentions. Would you trust the people who swore to protect you if they were the ones hiding the truth? Ashland wasn't the kind of place that welcomed suspicion. In a town where everyone knew everyone's name, guilt was something people whispered about in kitchens, not police stations. By the second week of the investigation, the line between fact and gossip had already started to blur. Detectives Hank Dwyer and Edna Cole tried to build a timeline, but every new lead came tangled with rumor. One woman claimed she'd seen Linda arguing with her ex-boyfriend near the park. Another swore a group of drifters had been camping near the river. A teacher from Linda's school whispered about a scandal, something about a married man, hushed meetings, and bad judgment. It was Tobias Kincaid who volunteered to help calm the chaos. The town's high school principal, respected, polite, and articulate, he offered the department any assistance they might need. He organized search parties, arranged food drives for the volunteers, even offered the church hall as a coordination center. On the surface, he was exactly what the case needed: leadership, control, reassurance. Detective Cole didn't like it. "He's too present," she said one night. leaning over her desk. Men like him don't insert themselves unless they need to see what we know. But Kincaid was beloved. The mayor praised him publicly. Newspapers called him a pillar of the community. Dwyer's suspicion was brushed aside as cynicism. "We can't afford to alienate the only one holding this town together," his captain warned. Meanwhile, evidence began to slip through the cracks. A boot print found near the scene was never photographed properly. A neighbor's statement about hearing a scream was misplaced. The dark sedan that multiple witnesses mentioned was linked to 3 different owners, all cleared without follow-up. The search dragged into its 3rd month. Funding was drying up, morale collapsing. Families stopped volunteering. News coverage faded, and the silence settled in like dust. Kincaid stood at the next town meeting, thanking everyone for not giving up. His words were smooth, his voice steady. "Linda Harper will be found," he said. "We owe her that much." He smiled as the room applauded. No one noticed the dirt under his fingernails. By the end of summer 1975, the case file on Linda Harper was already thinning out. Leads had gone cold. Witnesses stopped returning calls. The local paper moved on to news stories: a factory fire, a high school football championship, a mayoral election. The city had found new noise to cover its guilt. Inside the Ashland Police Department, Detective Edna Cole was still pushing. She'd spent weeks rereading every report, every note, every photograph. "Something's missing," she kept saying. "Something's off." But her partner, Hank Dwyer, was already burned out. The captain wanted the case cleared, the mayor wanted calm, and the state police had bigger priorities than a missing teacher from a quiet town. Dwyer dropped the final report on her desk one evening. "They're calling it inactive," he said, the words dry in his mouth. Cole didn't answer. She just looked at the list of items logged as evidence: a purse, a planner, a scarf, a broken pen. No fingerprints, no suspects, no closure. Just pages of effort leading to nothing. She thought about Tobias Kincaid, the helpful principal who always seemed to appear when cameras were rolling, who shook every officer's hand, who offered sympathy like a man rehearsing it. She'd mentioned her concerns to the captain twice. Both times, she was told to focus on credible leads. The department couldn't risk accusing a respected figure without proof. Proof that she was now being told didn't exist. So the case was boxed, labeled H-1975, Harper, Linda unsolved, and stored in the back corner of the records room. A week later, the news crew aired one final segment, a short goodbye to a story that had once filled their headlines. The segment ended with footage from the town memorial, Tobias Kincaid standing among mourners, holding a candle that flickered against his calm, expressionless face. In the years that followed, Cole transferred to another district. Dwyer retired quietly. The police station was renovated twice, but the box stayed in the same spot. Dust gathered on its edges, its label faded, but inside, the pieces of a life remained waiting. At home, Margaret Harper refused to let go. She kept calling, writing, demanding. Every month for years, she'd leave the same message on the department's answering machine. "Have you found her yet?" The file closed, but her mother never did. The file on Linda Harper didn't just grow cold, it froze solid. By 1976, the case had slipped from headlines into whispers. People stopped talking about her disappearance in public, but her name still lived quietly in the edges of conversations. The story of the missing teacher became the town's superstition, a warning, a bedtime caution. Don't walk alone after dark, or you'll end up like Linda Harper. Margaret Harper, her mother, refused to let it rest. Every first Monday of the month, she sat at her kitchen table and wrote a letter to the Oregon State Police, her pen pressing harder with each passing year. "Please reopen my daughter's case," she'd write. "Please don't forget her." The responses stopped coming after 1980. But she kept sending them anyway, because stopping would have felt like surrender. The detectives who had led the case didn't last much longer in the system. Hank Dwyer retired early, his health collapsing under the strain of what he called the one that got away. Edna Cole, the only person who ever spoke openly about her doubts, was transferred north and eventually left law enforcement entirely. By the time she died in 1989, the last copy of her field notes sat forgotten in a box marked personal effects. Meanwhile, Tobias Kincaid was thriving. His face appeared in newspapers again, this time for fundraisers, school events, and civic awards. He published a book on Ashland's founding families, became a guest lecturer at the local college, and eventually retired as a beloved community figure. People shook his hand at grocery stores, invited him to weddings, asked him to speak at graduations. He had learned how to outlive suspicion by turning himself into something useful. The younger generation only knew him as Mr. Kincaid, the kind old man who handed out apples to children every Halloween. The fear that had once filled the town was now just a faint echo, drowned out by new faces, new worries, new life. But for Margaret, there was no new. Her daughter's room stayed untouched, clothes neatly folded, a book left open on the desk. Every night, she'd turn on the lamp by the window, the same one Linda used to read beside. Neighbors called it her grief light, but Margaret called it something else, her way home. By the 1990s, the story of Linda Harper had transformed from tragedy to folklore. The people who'd once known her were growing old, and those who hadn't were raised on half-remembered tales. Teenagers dared each other to walk through Lithia Park after dark, whispering about the teacher who walked into the fog. Some said she'd run off with a man. Others said she'd fallen into the river and was never found. The details changed every few years, but the ghost remained the same, a name without a face. The town's pride became its amnesia. Ashland grew wealthier, safer, and quieter. Art festivals replaced neighborhood watches. New families moved in, drawn by the charm of its old streets and mountain air. They never knew about the gas station that once sat at the edge of town, the one that had been torn down to make room for a parking lot. That was where Tobias Kincaid still went for his morning walks. Gray-haired now, always well-dressed, always polite. People greeted him warmly. "Good morning, Mr. Kincaid," they'd call out, never realizing they were waving to a ghost of a different kind, one still alive, one still pretending to be human. He became the town's unofficial historian, giving lectures about the old Ashland days, the families that built it, and the values that made it strong. When someone brought up Linda's name during a Q&A at a college event in 1997, he paused only briefly, smiled faintly, and said, "Yes, a sad story. The kind that reminds us how precious life is." That answer earned him applause. But beneath the applause, the town's conscience stayed buried. No one looked deeper. No one connected the subtle unease in Tobias's tone or the way his eyes shifted when her name surfaced. Even the old case file had become a forgotten curiosity in the archives of the police department. A single box on a forgotten shelf, tucked between decades of paperwork that no one had touched since the building's last renovation. The words, Harper, Linda H. 1975, had nearly faded from its spine. And still, Margaret Harper's light never went out. By now, she was frail, her hands trembling when she wrote. But every month, the same ritual continued. A letter, a plea, a memory. She'd begun sending them to the governor's office after the police stopped responding. In the new Ashland, people said she was the crazy old woman who couldn't let go. They didn't understand that she wasn't waiting for peace. She was waiting for the truth. By 2011, Tobias Kincaid was an old man. His once commanding presence had softened into frailty. His hair had gone white, his voice a little weaker, but his reputation that remained untouched. He was a guest of honor at historical banquets, a mentor to local leaders, even a recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Award for service to the community. When he smiled for the cameras, no one questioned what his hands had done long before those photos were ever taken. The mountains watched, though. They always did. That same year, Margaret Harper passed away quietly in her sleep. Her neighbors found her sitting in her armchair, a half-written letter on her lap. The envelope was addressed, as always, to the Oregon State Police. Inside, Only 5 words. Don't let her be forgotten. Her funeral was small, a few church members, a handful of former students who remembered Linda, and a single detective from the cold case division who'd come out of respect for a mother who never stopped asking questions. That detective's name was Dana Morales. She noticed the framed photo on the front pew, a young woman smiling in front of a chalkboard, her handwriting looping across the blackboard behind her. 3 years later, Morales joined a statewide project aimed at digitizing unsolved case files. On a rainy afternoon in 2020, she opened a box marked H1975 and found Linda Harper's evidence, her scarf, her broken pen, her purse, and a folded police report dated nearly half a century earlier. It shouldn't have been anything special, just another file, another face in a sea of forgotten names. But Morales couldn't shake the look in Linda's photo. It stayed with her, the way old guilt does. So she checked the evidence log again and saw that a small fragment of fabric from Linda's blouse had been sealed in plastic, never tested, preserved only because someone had misplaced it during the original filing. Morales sent it to the lab for forensic genome sequencing. Weeks passed, then came the call. A partial match, a family name that hadn't appeared anywhere in the case file before, Kincaid. For almost 50 years, no one knew a killer lived among them. If time can hide the truth that long, what's hiding in your own neighborhood? Subscribe. Stay aware. It began quietly, a dusty box, lifted from the corner of an archive no one had touched in years. Detective Dana Morales stood beneath the hum of fluorescent lights, holding the faded cardboard container labeled H1975. Harper, Linda. Inside, wrapped in old evidence paper and tied with yellowing tape, was the weight of a story that time had tried to erase. The cold case unit had been tasked with digitizing every unsolved file in Oregon's Southern District. For most officers, it was just routine work, cataloging, scanning, archiving. But Morales wasn't built for routine. When she saw Linda's name, something pulled at her. Maybe it was the date, 1975. Maybe it was the handwritten note pinned to the front. Unresolved, no viable leads. The contents were carefully logged. Purse, broken pen, lesson planner, scarf. Morales's fingers paused over that scarf, a soft, torn piece of fabric sealed in plastic, tagged "Recovered near vehicle." No usable prints. It was an afterthought, a scrap that decades of investigators had overlooked. But Morales knew science had changed since 1975. The methods that once failed now whispered possibility. She requested lab testing through forensic-grade genome sequencing, the most advanced tool for extracting DNA from degraded materials. It was a long shot. Most evidence this old yielded nothing. But Linda Harper had waited nearly 50 years. A few more weeks would not matter. Weeks later, Morales received a call from the lab technician. His voice was calm, but she could hear at that edge of disbelief. "Detective," he said, "you're going to want to see this in person." When she arrived, he pointed at the glowing monitor, the jagged lines of a mitochondrial DNA profile. It wasn't complete, but it was viable. A sample strong enough to run through the National Genealogical Database. For the first time since 1975, the case wasn't cold, it was breathing. The DNA profile was partial, but it was enough to light a fuse. Detective Dana Morales submitted the results to the National Forensic Genealogy Database, expecting months of silence. Instead, the first hit came back within days. A single entry flashed on her screen. A familial connection to Raymond Kincaid, age 58, residing in Medford, Oregon. Morales's pulse quickened. The surname wasn't familiar to her team, but as she dug through public records, the pieces began to align. Raymond Kincaid, she discovered, had once been registered as the nephew of Tobias Kincaid, the retired principal and historian known throughout Southern Oregon. Her eyes narrowed. She'd seen that name before, on a decades-old newspaper clipping in the Harper case file. Local principal assists police in ongoing search for missing teacher. It hit her like a slow-moving earthquake. For 48 years, Tobias Kincaid had been praised as the man who helped search for the very woman he killed. Morales ran a bloodline reconstruction, building a tree from DNA records. birth certificates, and archived census data. The connections formed like threads, narrowing down from generations of Kincaids to one direct link: Tobias. He wasn't in any criminal database, but the genetic proximity was too close to ignore. Her next step was confirmation. She needed direct DNA living evidence. Morales began reviewing Kincaid's recent public records, discovering he still lived in Ashland, just 5 blocks from the original police station where Linda's case had died. He was 71 now. Still active in the community, still respected, still free. Morales printed his photo from the local historical society's website, smiling, distinguished, standing beside a plaque that read, "Preserving Ashland's Past for Future Generations." She studied that smile for a long time. The same mouth that spoke at school assemblies. The same voice that offered comfort to a grieving mother. The same hands that placed flowers at Linda Harper's memorial. The blood didn't lie. It never does. Detective Dana Morales didn't make arrests on instincts, but instincts had always told her when a truth was circling. Now, science had caught up. All it needed was proof to anchor the ghost. Kincaid's name hadn't crossed a police report in half a century, and yet his life was still painted across Ashland like a mural of false virtue. He hosted community lectures at the library, visited schools to speak about history and values, and still kept a tidy house near the river. Everyone saw him as harmless, the kindly old man who'd never hurt a soul. Morales started small, quiet, watching him. She spent 2 weeks building a pattern. Coffee at 8 a.m., walks at noon, church on Sundays. Nothing suspicious, nothing except the steadiness of a man who'd lived too long without consequence. Then opportunity came. One cold morning, she followed him to Riverside Diner, where he ordered the same breakfast he'd been having for years, black coffee and eggs over easy. When he left, she waited. The waitress cleared the counter, gathered the cup, and tossed it into the bin behind the shop. Morales walked over calmly, slipped on a glove, and pulled the cup from the trash. The lab results took days. Each hour dragged like a decade. Then, the call came, the same tremor she'd heard once before in a technician's voice. "Detective, we have a match." The DNA recovered from Kincaid's coffee cup aligned perfectly with the mitochondrial sample from Linda Harper's scarf. A 100% genetic match. Morales didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just stared at the printout in her hands, her chest heavy with the weight of 48 years of silence. The truth was finally standing in daylight, quiet, patient, undeniable. In another time, in another world, Kincaid had fooled them all, but not this time. The lie was over. The arrest warrant sat unsigned on Detective Dana Morales' desk for 3 days. It wasn't hesitation, it was disbelief. How could a man like Tobias Kincaid, a face so firmly etched into the story of Ashland's goodness, be capable of such a monstrous lie? At 71, he was the last person anyone would have suspected. He spent his mornings tending to the garden behind his modest home, his afternoons giving lectures about heritage and morality, his evenings walking the same path by the river where Linda Harper had vanished all those years ago. To the world, he was harmless, a relic of a gentler time. To Morales, he was proof that evil didn't always leave fingerprints. Sometimes, it just learned how to smile. She decided to watch him one more time before the confrontation. Ashland Historical Society, Thursday evening. Kincaid was speaking to a crowd of retirees and local teachers, his voice soft, his posture steady. The topic was preserving the past, the responsibility of memory. The irony was acid on Morales' tongue. She sat in the back, her eyes locked on him as he spoke. Every phrase about integrity, every word about truth, felt like a confession in disguise. He gestured calmly, smiled at his audience, and used the same hands that had once pressed against Linda Harper's throat. When the lecture ended, Morales followed him outside. Kincaid walked slowly, greeting people by name, laughing gently when one of his former students told him how much he'd meant to her education. He thanked her kindly, placed a hand on her shoulder, and said, "It's good to know I made a difference." That line hit Morales like a hammer. He had made a difference, just not the kind anyone could forgive. Back at the station, she reviewed the DNA match for the 100th time. The result hadn't changed. Science didn't care about charm, reputation, or the decades a man had stolen. It only cared about truth. And this truth had a name: Tobias Kincaid. The quiet man who had written himself into history and buried his crime inside it. The confession would come later, but Detective Morales already knew how it happened. She had studied every report, every distance, every timestamp, every silence in the timeline. When she reconstructed that February night in 1975, the story unfolded not as a mystery, but as an inevitability. It started with kindness. That's how monsters always begin. Linda Harper, exhausted from her long day, had pulled into the gas station. Tobias Kincaid, the dependable attendant, smiled and waved her over. Maybe she'd stopped there before. Maybe she trusted him because everyone did. He offered to top off her tank, and when she mentioned her car was making a strange sound, he told her to follow him to the service bay around the back. She hesitated, but the man wore a clean shirt, a school ID badge, a name everyone knew. He wasn't a stranger. He was the principal. Once the lights of the gas pumps faded behind them, she realized the mistake. He asked her questions that weren't about the car, about her job, her plans to move away, whether she had anyone waiting for her that night. When she answered, he smiled too long. Then his tone changed. "You shouldn't be walking home this late," he said. "Not alone." When she tried to leave, his hand closed around her wrist. She pulled free, but his grip returned harder. The bracelet she wore snapped, beads scattering across the concrete. She shouted his name, not in fear at first, but in disbelief. It didn't matter. He struck her, once, then again. Panic followed, not rage. He dragged her to his car, wrapped her scarf around her neck, and drove toward the river. The rain hid everything but the guilt. Later, when he gave his statement to police, he'd remember every detail except that drive. That was the lie that kept him safe for half a century. In the days after the DNA results came back, Detective Morales couldn't help but marvel at how normal his life looked. Tobias Kincaid lived in a neat yellow house with trimmed hedges, a white porch swing, and decades of framed photographs on his walls. Students, graduations, fundraisers, smiling faces, frozen in the illusion that this man had built a life worth admiring. Everywhere she looked, the town's affection for him still lingered. People waved when he walked his dog. He received invitations to alumni dinners and historical talks. There were thank you cards on his mantle, some decades old, all signed by names that had no idea they were thanking a murderer. Morales built her case in silence. Surveillance footage, witness logs, phone records, the genetic link between Kincaid and the scarf, the lab results. Every piece tightened the circle until there was no room left for denial. When she finally presented the file to her chief, he stared at the name for a long time before saying quietly, "That's the last person anyone would have suspected." That was the point. For nearly 50 years, Tobias had constructed an identity that insulated him from truth. He'd built a career on discipline, education, and respect, all while living beside the memory of what he'd done. He'd become the man parents trusted with their children, the man who gave eulogies, taught morality, and wrote books about the importance of preserving history. But it was his own history he guarded most. Every time he stood in front of a classroom, chalk in hand, talking about the lessons of the past, his words were soaked in irony. "History," he once said during a lecture recorded by local television, "is what we leave behind when the world stops asking questions." It was the only truth he ever spoke aloud. When Morales reviewed that recording, she paused it on his face older, hollow, unaware that the questions he'd evaded for half a century had finally caught up. He spent 50 years teaching history, but never confessed to the one he wrote himself. It happened just after sunrise. The mist clung low over Ashland, painting the streets in soft gray as two unmarked cruisers rolled down Pinecrest Avenue. Inside the modest yellow house at the corner, Tobias Kincaid was sitting at his kitchen table, reading the morning paper, a half-finished cup of coffee steaming beside him. The same quiet routine he'd lived for nearly 50 years. Detective Dana Morales stood at the gate, her breath steady, warrant in hand. She could hear the faint sound of birds, ordinary, almost peaceful, before she gave the signal. 3 officers moved in. A firm knock. "Mr. Kincaid, Ashland Police Department. We need you to step outside." Through the frosted glass, she saw his silhouette pause. For a moment, nothing. Then the door opened, slow and measured. He didn't ask why they were there. He didn't resist. He simply looked at the badge, then at Morales, and said in a voice that was calm, almost rehearsed, "I suppose it was only a matter of time." The officers cuffed him gently, as though afraid to break the illusion of respect that still clung to him. Neighbors peeked through curtains. Cameras flashed. The sound of shutters echoed down the street. As he was led to the patrol car, Tobias turned his head toward the rising sun and murmured something Morales almost didn't catch. "She wanted to leave Ashland. I couldn't let her ruin her reputation." No apology, no remorse. Just control, the same cold authority that had defined his life. Inside the house, the search began. It didn't take long. A shoebox beneath his bed held yellowed newspaper clippings, "Missing Teacher Still Unfound, 1975. A locket, a faded photograph of Linda Harper, smiling in front of a chalkboard. A piece of red fabric, folded carefully between the pages of a book titled The Preservation of Memory. For Morales, that was the breaking point. She closed the box slowly and whispered, "You kept her." Outside, the wind carried the sound of church bells, the same church where Tobias had once preached morality, shaking hands with the same people who now stood speechless on the sidewalk. The teacher was gone, but the lesson had arrived. The search of Tobias Kincaid's property extended far beyond his home. Forensics teams and local deputies spent 2 days combing through every inch of the land registered in his name. That was when Detective Dana Morales found the deed, an old family cabin 40 miles north of Ashland on the edge of the Siskiyou Forest. It hadn't been visited in years, at least not officially. But Morales knew. Monsters always keep a place for their ghosts. The drive there was long and silent. Pines lined the road like witnesses, the air thick with the kind of quiet that makes you listen for something that isn't there. When they arrived, the cabin stood small and crooked, its porch half collapsed under years of neglect. Behind it, the ground was uneven, the kind of irregular slope that catches a detective's eye. A crime scene technician moved closer, crouching near a patch of disturbed soil. "Here," he said softly. Hours later, as the excavation lights flickered against the trees, the first piece of fabric surfaced. Then, bone. Then, a rusted bracelet chain. The same one Edna Cole had once logged as missing evidence in 1975. Morales knelt beside the edge of the dig, the wind pressing cold against her face. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The truth was already rising from the earth, slow, steady, undeniable. When the remains were confirmed through dental records, the report reached Ashland Police Headquarters before dawn. Linda Harper had been found. The news spread through the town like an old wound reopening. For the older residents, her name was a whisper they hadn't dared say in years. For the younger generation, it was the first time they realized the smiling man who'd taught them history had been the reason one of their own never got to live hers. That morning, the church bell rang 12 times. Not for Sunday service, for closure, for confession, for the end of 50 years of silence. Morales stood at the river's edge outside the cabin, looking toward the water that ran past the roots and stones. She thought of what he'd said during the arrest. She wanted to leave Ashland. Now, she finally had. By the time the evening news hit, Ashland had already changed. The story broke across every channel. Cold case solved after nearly 50 years. Beloved educator arrested in murder of missing teacher. Television anchors spoke his name carefully, almost reluctantly, as if saying it too loudly might shatter what was left of the town's innocence. Footage of Tobias Kincaid's arrest replayed on a loop. The handcuffs, the yellow house, the mist curling around his shoulders like shame itself. For those who had known him, disbelief turned to nausea. For those who hadn't, fear took its place. At the local diner, people sat in silence, coffee cups cooling in their hands. "I trusted him with my kids," one woman whispered. "He baptized my daughter," said another. The room stayed quiet after that. No one wanted to be the next to confess how close they'd been to evil without ever realizing it. Across town, at a small retirement home on the edge of Ashland, Margaret Harper sat in her wheelchair, her television tuned to the same broadcast. 93 years old, her voice little more than a breath, she watched as the screen filled with the image of the man who had stolen her daughter's life. When the reporter said Linda's remains had been found behind the old Kincaid cabin, she closed her eyes. Her lips trembled before forming 4 quiet words. She can rest now. It was the first piece she had spoken in half a century. Back at the station, Detective Morales stood by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. The mountains loomed in the distance, the same peaks that had stood watch over this town since before the crime, before the silence, before the lie. For 50 years, they had held their secret. But secrets rot when left too long in the dark. As the wind rolled through the valley, Morales thought of Linda, of her smile in that old photograph, of the light she had brought into classrooms that never saw her again. The mountains had kept her, but the truth had never belonged to them. The courthouse in Medford, Oregon, filled long before proceedings began. The crowd was a collage of faces, students who once sat in his classroom, parents who had trusted him, reporters clutching recorders, and the last of Ashland's older residents who remembered the day Linda Harper vanished. The marble floors carried a tension that no one dared speak aloud. When Tobias Kincaid entered, the room fell silent. He looked smaller now, swallowed by the gray suit his lawyer had pressed that morning. His hands trembled slightly, not from guilt, but age. Still, when he glanced toward the gallery, his eyes were sharp, assessing as though he was still the man who commanded a classroom, not the one who had taken a life. The judge read the charges: murder in the first degree. The prosecutor stood, outlining the timeline, the DNA, the buried remains, and the decades of deception that had allowed Kincaid to live freely among the very people he'd deceived. Every word echoed like a hammer on bone. When asked for his plea, Kincaid spoke softly. "An Alford plea, Your Honor." It was the kind of plea that let him say he didn't remember, that he didn't have to admit guilt, only that the evidence was enough to convict. A coward's confession dressed in legal language. He leaned closer to the microphone and added, "I have no memory of that night." Gasps rippled through the gallery. One former student wept openly. The judge's gavel struck once for order, but the sound did nothing to still the current running through the room. Across the aisle, Detective Morales sat rigid, her jaw tight. She'd heard that line before from men who hid behind time and weakness. No memory, she thought, is not the same as no responsibility. Outside, the sky was clear, bright, and cruelly indifferent. The trial stretched into its 3rd week, each day peeling back another layer of the lie Tobias Kincaid had lived behind. What the town once called integrity was now being rewritten as cruelty wrapped in calm. The prosecution built its case slowly, every witness adding weight to the years that had buried Linda Harper's name in silence. First came the forensic experts. They spoke without drama, only precision. The scarf, the fibers, the DNA, it all connected. Dr. Elise Rowan, head of the state lab, said it best. Decay hides nothing from science. Even after decades, truth breathes through what remains. The courtroom was still when she said it. Even Kincaid looked down, his jaw tightening for just a moment, before he resumed the blank stare that had become his mask. Then came the testimonies that cut deeper than science. A former teacher from Ashland High School took the stand. Her voice cracked as she described how Kincaid had comforted the staff after Linda's disappearance, the meetings he'd led, the prayers he'd offered, the way he'd turned grief into attention. "He made us think he cared," she said, tears falling freely now. He was leading the search while he knew exactly where she was. The final witness was Anna Harper, Linda's younger sister, now in her 60s. Her hands trembled as she unfolded a faded photograph. Linda at 24, her smile caught mid-laugh. "This is who he took from us," she said quietly. "Not just my sister, but the years we were supposed to have. The birthdays, the holidays, the simple days that never came back." She turned toward Kincaid. "You gotta grow old." She didn't. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face. A momentary loss of control, a muscle tightening along his jaw. It wasn't remorse. It was exposure. By the time the closing arguments began, Tobias Kincaid had become something unrecognizable. Not a man, but a monument to deceit finally crumbling. The jury watched him closely, yet he never once raised his eyes to meet theirs. He sat motionless, his hands folded neatly on the table, the same practiced posture he'd used for years when lecturing about ethics and history. The prosecutor's final words were quiet but carried like thunder through the room. "Justice," he said, "doesn't fade. It waits. It waited 48 years for this day. It waited for science to speak, for memory to resurface, for truth to outlast comfort." No one breathed as the sentence was read: life imprisonment without parole. Even then, Kincaid didn't flinch. He merely nodded once, as though accepting a verdict he'd rehearsed long ago. When the bailiff moved to escort him out, he paused, glancing toward the window where the faint outline of the Siskiyou Mountains glimmered in the morning light. For a heartbeat, he smiled, not in peace, but defiance, the look of a man who had convinced himself that silence was power. He was wrong. In the front row, Anna Harper gripped the edge of her seat. She wasn't smiling, but she was steady. For the first time since 1975, she felt like her sister's voice had finally been heard. A few weeks later, before the official sentencing was entered into record, Margaret Harper passed away in her sleep. Her obituary was short. It said only what she would have wanted. She lived long enough to see truth prevail. At her funeral, Anna placed the photo of Linda beside their mother's headstone. 2 names, one shadow finally resting. Back in the courthouse, the gavel struck once more to close the record. The sound lingered, not like an ending, but an echo. Because the story wasn't over. It was finally being told. The gavel didn't close her story. It preserved it. Winter came early to Ashland that year. Snow dusted the park benches, settled gently on the iron railings, and turned Lithia Park into something softer, quieter. The cold didn't keep people away. They gathered at dusk, candles in hand, bundled in scarves, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. For the first time, the annual memorial was no longer about a disappearance. It was about a life finally brought home. At the front of the crowd, a framed photograph of Linda Harper rested on a stand newly restored, her features clear and bright again. Her smile hadn't aged, even if everything around her had. A group of students from Ashland High took turns reading her poems aloud, their voices trembling slightly in the wind. They weren't born when she vanished, but her story had become theirs, passed down not as fear, but as faith, that truth always finds a way back. Detective Dana Morales stood at the edge of the park, her hands tucked into her coat pockets, watching the candlelight ripple through the crowd. She didn't step forward to speak. This wasn't her night, it was Linda's. Still, when the mayor called her name and urged her to say a few words, she took the microphone quietly, her voice low but unwavering. "Technology solves," she began, "but compassion heals. We found the truth because we had better tools, yes. But what made us keep looking was humanity. A mother who refused to forget. A sister who never stopped asking. A town that finally learned how to listen." She paused, looking toward the mountains in the distance, now barely visible beneath the falling snow. "Justice," she said, "isn't about punishment. It's about memory and the courage to keep it alive." The audience fell silent. A few candles flickered out, but others were lifted to relight them. Light passing from hand to hand, warmth shared against the cold. When Morales stepped back, she saw a small girl near the front clutching a candle almost as tall as her forearm. She looked up at Linda's photo, whispering, "You're home now." That was the legacy, not tragedy, but return. The following spring, Linda's name left Ashland and reached the halls of Oregon State University. In a ceremony attended by detectives, lawmakers, and students, the Department of Criminal Justice announced a new annual award, the Linda Harper Memorial Scholarship, granted to young investigators committed not only to solving crimes but to honoring the humanity behind them. The hall was quiet as Detective Dana Morales took the podium again. Her speech wasn't long. It didn't need to be. The silence carried the weight of the story everyone there already knew. "When a case goes cold," she said, "it doesn't disappear. It waits for someone to care enough to bring it back into the light." Linda Harper's story reminds us that even when years pass, even when the world moves on, truth is patient. It doesn't rot. It doesn't fade. It stays. In the front row sat Anna Harper, Linda's sister, her hair now silver but her eyes sharp with pride. She held a folded piece of paper, one of Linda's lesson plans recovered from her old car. The ink blurred, but the words still legible. "Teach them kindness," it read. "Always lead with that first." When the scholarship was announced, Anna was asked to say a few words. She walked slowly to the stage, her hand brushing across the wooden railing as she steadied herself. Her voice was soft, but it carried through the auditorium. Linda believed in small acts, in the idea that doing good didn't have to be loud to matter. She gave her time, her heart, her patience, and for 50 years, that's what the world took from her. But tonight, she gives it back. Applause followed, not thunderous, but respectful, steady, sincere. Students stood, some holding candles, others holding notebooks. One young woman in the back whispered to her friend, "That's why I want to do this. That's why I'm studying forensics." Outside, the Oregon spring had begun to thaw the last of the snow. The campus bell rang in the distance, its tone soft and clear. Linda Harper's name had once been a headline. Now, it was a lesson one the state vowed never to forget. Months after the sentencing, Detective Dana Morales returned to Lithia Park alone. It was early morning, the kind of quiet hour when even the air seems to listen. The snow had melted, the ground soft beneath her boots. A new plaque stood near the bridge by the water, simple and unadorned. In memory of Linda Harper, teacher, dreamer, daughter of Ashland. Morales traced the letters with her fingertips, the metal still cool from the night before. She thought of the years it took to reach this moment, the generations that had lived and died while Linda's name slept inside a forgotten box. She thought of Margaret Harper, who'd written her last letter asking the world not to forget, and of Anna, who'd found strength in speaking her sister's name aloud before hundreds of strangers. Justice had arrived late, but it had arrived with precision, not as vengeance, but as truth, clear, measured, final. Morales sat on a nearby bench, the same one where volunteers had gathered during the search in 1975. The river whispered faintly behind her, steady and timeless, carrying away the fragments of what the town once chose to ignore. In her pocket, she carried something small, a piece of red ribbon recovered from the excavation near Kincaid's cabin. She'd kept it not as evidence, but as a reminder of the cost of silence, of the fragility of time, and of the resilience of memory. She closed her eyes and exhaled. For the first time since reopening the case, she felt still. Not satisfied, not triumphant, just quiet. From the distance, the sound of school bells echoed through the valley. Children's laughter followed, faint but clear, rolling through the cold morning air. Morales smiled, because that was the sound Linda had loved most. The sound of life continuing. The wind lifted, scattering a few petals from a nearby tree. They drifted across the plaque, catching the light as they fell into the river. In that small moment, everything felt right again. Not whole, but right. In a city of thousands, one young woman refused to be forgotten. And because she held on, so did justice.